We only focus on that gap. That is a recipe for misery.
Yeah. And in the book, Dan Sullivan compares it against chasing the horizon or chasing
Hmm.
the rainbow,
Chasing the rainbow.
right?
Yeah.
Like yes, it is great. You have to have goals. Like they're the only thing moving you forward, right? It's like, where am I going?
Hmm.
Where do I want to be? But when you're measuring against that, when you keep on the rainbow, it just gets further and further away. Like, welcome to Habit Masters, where we are all about helping you create the habits to live your best life. I'm Jeff,
I'm Sheldon.
and today we have a very exciting topic to share with you. It comes from a part of our course, which is the final day, I think, of our course. So if you haven't
Day
taken our
7.
course,
Yeah.
we'll put a link in here for 20% off in the show notes so you can go take advantage of that. It's $97, but you do it with a buddy. So go check it out if you haven't. This is one of the final days that we talk about the gap and the gain.
Yes. So this episode is for all the people out there who at the end of the day, no matter how much you've done, you had a checklist of 1,000, you've checked off 998 of them, right? And you feel like it's just not enough. It's never enough, right? It's just, no matter what I do, it never seems to be enough. This is for you. This is for us, I should say.
Yeah, and we call that living in the gap.
Yeah.
Actually, Dan Sullivan calls that living in the gap.
Yeah. He kind of coined the phrase. Yeah.
Yep. And he says this, just to get a description of what living in the gap or the gain means. He says, your future growth and progress are now based in your understanding about the difference between the two ways in which you can measure yourself against an ideal, which puts you in what I call the gap, and against your starting point, which puts you in the gain, appreciating all that you have accomplished. So today, our goal of this episode is to help you move from spending time in the gap, which you're going to do still. Obviously, nobody's perfect at this. We all live in the gap to some extent. But as much as you can, being conscious of when you are in the gap and shifting that mentality to be living in the gain so that you can escape what we're phrasing the gap trap.
Yeah. There's a book called The Happiness Advantage, although I'd recommend going and watching the TED Talk because it's just like a dense nugget of this principle, this idea. He talks about success and working harder. And let me just read a little bit. Most of us feel that if I work harder, I'll be more successful. And if I'm more successful, then I'll be happier. If I accomplish X and Y, then I'll be happy. And the soundtrack kind of like, this is the narrative that we live by sometimes. But scientifically, like that's broken. That's backwards. And every time we reach success, like our brain just moves the goalpost on what success looks like, right? You get good grades, now you have to get better grades. You got a good job, now you have to get a better job, right? You make this much money now, and you make more money. You run a half marathon, God, do a full, it's just like that goalpost is always changing, right? And if happiness or success is always on the opposite side, like cognitively speaking, we never actually get there. We push happiness over what he calls the cognitive horizon. We're chasing an ideal, which we never actually reach. Right? That's living in the gap. And because we think we have to be successful before we're happy, but the opposite should be true. We can find happiness here now in the progress, measuring the progress. That's what this is all about on the journey. And ironically speaking, that will help us find more success. He goes into all these examples about, measuring doctors who, when they're in a happy state versus a neutral or negative mental state, and how they literally they're quicker at finding diagnoses and accurate diagnoses, and just like literally like using a popsicle, right? It's like all these things, like when we are in a happier, positive state, we literally just perform and function better.
Yeah. It's so hard. Like we all get into this gap mentality when we set goals, we strive for things, and then we don't quite reach them.
Yeah.
And so we get to like midway through our goal and like maybe it's taking longer than we expected. And I'm living in this right now, right? We have these goals set for my business right now. And I've been struggling to accomplish a couple of the tasks that need to be done for us to actually launch our new website. So I'm sitting here with this 80% of the way there website, and I can't quite integrate my inventory system. So my inventory system, we're working on that right now, but it was supposed to be done several months ago. And so I'm getting impatient. And that's one other way that we live in the gap is we feel like, oh, we should be there by now and we're not, right? So there's several ways of living in the gap. It's It's measuring against an ideal is probably the number one, which is rampant in our day and age with social media. And, there's Joneses on every corner and on your phone at all times. It's like,
Right.
the Joneses are constantly in my face telling me how perfect their life is, right? Here's the real truth behind that is it's not. Right? Their life's not perfect. It's not.
No, it's their curated highlight reel is what it is.
Yeah.
We compare ourselves to a very specific curated highlight reel, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's
Well,
difficult.
and I was thinking about this earlier. A good example for that is, imagine you're starting a football game, right? And or any sport for that matter, be it a soccer game, be it a football game, baseball, whatever, and you're all at zero, right? You start any game you play at zero, but for some reason in life, we think we should be starting at 100. It's like, well, why am I not Dwayne the Rock Johnson yet? Like, I should be the most famous man on the planet. Like, we're measuring ourselves against this ideal out there when we're starting out, and that's just not fair to wish we had 100 points right when the game begins. It's not fair to ourselves is what I'm saying, right? Well, and another way that this happens, and this is an example I was just talking to Sheldon about, is I have 3 boys. 2 are getting a little older. One of them I gave a present to a couple of years ago for Christmas. He got one of those little hoverboards. And his brother at the time wanted a mountain bike, so he didn't get the hoverboard. So he has a hoverboard, and he's had it for the last year and a half. And so now we ended up getting a birthday present for the other son of a hoverboard. And the first son with the hoverboard is now being like, hey, well, I think his is a little better than mine. I think his goes a little faster than mine. He keeps making comments to us like that, like, my hoverboard, I think his might be better on the carpet or whatever. And it's just funny to me because up until the moment his brother got one, he was elated. He was super happy with his hoverboard. And now he's found himself in the gap of, well, his is newer than mine, and his has a little bit bigger wheels than mine, and all those things that come into play. And that's a big form of gap thinking as well.
I think it's really easy to see this in children because it's so often. It's like my wife, good cook, makes desserts, and it's like all excited, we're gonna have dessert, and then all of a sudden someone's like, oh, so and so's they got more than me, right? And all of a sudden they're miserable
Mm-hmm.
because they think, again, almost never actually reality. They just think that someone got something more than they did, right? Instead of being happy about, like, you went from nothing to this wonderful dessert, all they can think about is like, oh, my brother or sister got a little bit more than me, right?
Yeah.
Man, that just drives me bonkers. Stuff like that happens.
Well, and it's funny that you say that because it does. Like, as parents and as adults, we're like, come on, kid. But then we turn around and do the same
Yes.
thing, not realizing it, right? We do the same thing. We're like, oh, my neighbor's got a really nice car or whatever, right? Stuff that doesn't matter at all, but it's just something that goes into our brain. Or like, hey, why did this person get a raise and I didn't? Or whatever that looks for you, like in your life.
Oh gosh, confession time. Jeff and I were talking about some stuff before we started, and about an old friend of ours that we used to do some stuff with, and about what he's up to. And honestly, as I was like catching up, I found myself feeling a little bit of this, like, why haven't I figured this out yet? Why haven't I? Do you know what I mean?
You were living in the gap.
Like today, before this, and I thankfully, maybe because we were talking about this, I recognized that was happening. And I was like, gosh, like, how do I stop this, in the moment? Yeah.
So how do we stop? So I think these are all going to be helpful examples for you to understand when you're in the gap, because I think one thing that was the revelation to me when I first read Ben Hardy and Dan Sullivan's book, The Gap and the Gain, which, by the way, we are giving away for free while supplies last on our website. So I'll put the link in the show notes for that as well. We've been doing it for a while, but now that we're bringing it up on the show again, you guys can go snag a copy. It's a free Kindle copy on us, no strings attached, just because we think you're awesome for listening. So,
but it is a really good book. Don't let that. I mean, if you went to Kindle right now to buy it, it'd be $10. Like, this really is a deal.
Yeah. So save yourself $10 and get it from us. Okay. The cool thing about it, though, that was the revelation to me, is how often because I've always considered myself a pretty positive person. Like I'm like
too.
Generally have like a very positive outlook. I try not to compare, all those types of things. But after I read the book, I realized how many areas I was living in the gap in. And it
Yeah.
mostly had to do with my goals, my own ambitions,
Mm-hmm.
and where I was in progress to those. So not so much in the comparison realm of like against others. I
Physical
hope
or
in
beauty or money. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
not that I'm above those things, but I think hopefully I'm mature enough now that those don't bother me that much. I don't know for sure, right? But that's hopefully, like I said. But the biggest thing for me was just like, oh, in my own goals, I feel constantly like I'm lacking, like I'm not measuring up, like I'm not fulfilling to my fullest. There you go. That's a good phrase. And it's actually been a detriment to my success and my progress because when you are living in the gap, the number one thing you will find is that it slows your progress, that it dampens your motivation, and it really does
It destroys your
s-
happiness.
yeah, sap your energy and destroys your happiness, all those things because you're thinking you're not there yet.
Yeah.
And you're waiting for some destination to feel successful or feel happy or feel fulfilled. And what we're going to hopefully help you see today is that by turning your eyes backwards instead of forwards, and that sounds weird because you do want to keep moving forwards, but to measure and say, look how far I've come from where I was. When you do that, that is living in the gain. And Dan Sullivan has a great example in here. Sheldon, you want to share it?
Just before that, when I consider myself a very positive person, right? And it dawned on me reading the book how often I am living in this gap. If we're honest, we all know there is a gap between where we are and where we want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we only focus on that gap, that is a recipe for misery.
Yeah. And in the book, Dan Sullivan compares it against chasing the horizon or chasing
Mm-hmm.
the rainbow.
Chasing the rainbow.
Right?
Yeah.
Like yes, it is great. You have to have goals. Like they're the only thing moving you forward, right? It's like, where am I
Mm-hmm.
going? Where do I want to be? But when you're measuring against that, when you keep on like, oh, like the rainbow, it just gets further and further away. Like,
Yeah.
have you ever tried to chase a rainbow? It doesn't ever get closer.
I remember having this conversation with somebody who I was describing, they're asking me about stuff and just like, what am I doing? And work and life and family and church and physical and stuff. And I described some of the stuff and they were just like, wow, like you're doing a lot. And it dawned on me, I can't remember the last time I went to bed feeling like I'd accomplished everything I wanted. And I'm putting this in air quotes, should have accomplished that day.
It should have. Yeah,
Should
should
have. Yeah,
have.
exactly. Right. And it was like this dawning moment of like, oh my gosh, like this is just sapping my happiness and energy.
Mm-hmm. And there's a quote in there that we really liked that says, what is it? It's
There's no way to happiness. Happiness is the way.
yes, there is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way.
That is the happiness advantage. That is like the whole premise of that book
Mm-hmm.
is like all these tactics to find happiness along the way, right? It's like it can't be this goalpost that once I achieve this success, then I'll be happy. Once I
Mm-hmm.
achieve this goal, then I can be happy, right? You have to have a lifestyle and methods and happiness of living that way. And again, we all heard this like the gratitude journal, right? I've got one because I used it for quite a while. It's like at the end of the day, write 3 things you're grateful for because
Yeah.
I was in such a mindset of just like focusing on where I lacked and where I'd fallen short, where things weren't quite right. And okay, this is confession time a little bit. I've focusing on this, learning about, I've realized that how much this bled over into my thinking in general and how unwittingly it was hurting my relationship to my spouse and my children
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't want to. I wasn't consciously trying to do this, but like this is just the way I thought, right?
Yeah.
My pattern of thinking. And so how could it inevitably bleed over into that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Always focusing on oh, they did cleaning and it's like they did their chores and they picked up this, vacuumed this, except they didn't do this one portion over here. And what do I talk to them about? That one portion that they didn't quite get right. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the story. So this is Dan Sullivan and Bob is in this group. So these are the 2 characters. Dan asked Bob what he had accomplished in the previous 90 days, and Bob started sharing some of the progress his company had made. such as the new deal they'd secured. But immediately after sharing what they'd done, Bob began explaining that their progress didn't actually mean anything because it wasn't what could or should have happened. Yeah, but none of that really means anything because, and while listening to Bob devalue his progress and complain about his situation, it says Dan suddenly and clearly saw an explanation for a weird thing that successful entrepreneurs do to undermine their growth of confidence. This wasn't the first time he'd heard one of his clients grumble about their progress. Dan walked to his paper flip chart and drew a picture to explain to Bob what was happening. At the top of the paper, Dan wrote the word ideal. At the bottom of the page, he wrote start. Then between the two words on the middle of the page, he wrote achieved. Then he drew a line between the words achieved and ideal. This is where you were 90 days ago. You achieved this. This is what you've actually achieved in the last 90 days. The ideal is where you wish you were. You have an ideal in your mind and you're measuring yourself against your ideal rather than against the actual progress you've made. This is why you're unhappy with what you've done. And it's probably why you're unhappy with everything in your life. You're measuring yourself against the gap.
And the switch that has to be switched here is to simply measure against progress instead of your ideal. You may say to yourself, well, yeah, but that's like unrealistic. Like we, if we're trying to achieve something, and I would argue that the only way you will achieve it is creating a positive momentum.
Yeah.
And positive momentum comes from measuring those daily wins, the progress that you're making towards your ultimate goal. And it also brings happiness because you're enjoying the journey along the way. The moments that you create celebrating those things that are going well, and not everything goes well. This isn't a like stick your head in the sand, right? Like, there's going to be problems to fix. Here's a great comparison that I think stands out to me. As part of like my financial automation, I put away a certain amount of money into an investment fund every month. And this can just be like the progress you're making towards any goal, right? Like my end goal, of course, is to hopefully have millions of dollars available to me when I retire as a nest egg, as a backup plan, right? It's like, okay, if everything else horribly goes awry and all my money's gone, at least I have this nest egg that I can live off of. That's the goal, right? Live off your nest egg. So, but along the way, as you know, investments go up and down, right? Like 2021, an amazing investment year. Everybody was up 20, 30, 40%. Last year, 2022, not as good of a year, right? Everybody was down. And that's the way of the market. That's the way of investment funds, is that they tend to go up and down. And here's what happens if you pull your money out. Nothing. There's no growth at all. But as I looked over the years, even though 2022 wasn't great and I was feeling in the gap about it, like, oh man, I was down 20%. Well, the year before that, we were up almost 40%. So you got to think to yourself, all right, what's my gain? Well, I'm up 20% still. Like it doesn't always feel that way in the moment. But as you look over the progress that you've made over the last whatever time period that looks like, you're like, all right, I'm gaining, right? Even though it looks like a big dip, you're actually your trajectory is on an upward trend. And that's how progress really is made, because it's never perfectly up. Right? Sheldon's laughing over there. What do you got, Sheldon?
I'm thinking of mathematical equations between investments and losses. Yeah. Because if this year I had 100% gain and next year I had a 50% loss, they're actually equal.
Yeah. Well, so there you go. Right. So I'm even regardless. No, but as you go over the years, right, and what all investment advisors will tell you is the fact that over time there's always a trending up gain, right? If you look at the last couple hundred years, the market has gone 20-year period. That's right. The market has gone up, and that, so the better thing you can do is to measure backwards and not just to say like, oh, today sucked, but you can say like, oh, I missed today, but how many times did you do it this week? Like, especially we talk about habits a lot on the show. Shocker, right? And how many times did you do your activity this week? How many times did you do your activity this month? How many times did you do your activity this year? And even if for whatever reason, you're like, the last month I didn't do it this month, it's like, okay, well, let's go back to the beginning. When did you start making progress towards this new goal? Oh, 6 months ago. Okay, well, over the last 6 months, how much progress has you made? Because, and this isn't a delusional moment. It's a moment to give you energy to say, hey, I've done it before and I can do it again. It's like, I can make progress towards my goals. It might not be as fast as I want, And I'll tell you this, the more consistent you are, that compounds into greater results, right? The more consistent you are.
Well, and there's so many good ways to measure, I think, more effectively, right? It's like that's the reason we have our habit tracker. It's not so you can see the days you missed, it's so you can see the times you did it, because
Yeah.
that equals progress, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, I work with people who are struggling with certain propensities, like addictions, whatever, and instead of focusing on like the last time, right, it's trend lines. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, 5 months ago, this many slips, and it's as long as it's trending up, that's progress.
Yep.
And if you continue on that slope, that trajectory, you're gonna get there. May not be as quick as you want. Yeah, we get that. But if you only focus on like, the absolute end goal, and every time you ever fall short of it, that is a recipe for depression and unhappiness and just struggle and misery.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you brought it up. So 2 ways that we're going to suggest you track this, right? Because the next step for you is always to take action. It's like, okay, first identify where it is you're filling in the gap. What goal have you been working towards that you feel like you haven't been measuring up? You're being impatient with how slow it's going or whatever. You're not making the progress you were hoping to have, and that you're feeling behind. It's like, I love that phrase. People are like, oh, I'm so behind. I'm like, behind on what? Like, it's not, you're not in class. Like maybe you are in class. In that case, you are behind. You might be behind, but for the rest of us living normal life, unless you missed your tax date or something, like you're not behind, right? And I don't want to say you have all the time in the world. Make it count, obviously, but you got to stop feeling like you're behind and start saying like, I'm making progress every day, and change that. And the way to do that, start tracking. We have a habit tracker that you can use. You can download from our website for free. We'll give the link in the show notes. There's a lot of links today, so hopefully I remember to put them all in. I'll try. Hey, but if we get 2 out of 3, that's a gain, right? So, and then the other way actually was one of my coaching clients that took the idea of habit tracker and turned it into her own game that she's like, oh, this works even better for me. And we all are always about the modified version. Take the method that we give you and make it your own. What way could you make it better, easier, more effective for you? Because if you can do that, you can take these tools and turn them into something useful. Like the principles are true no matter what, or I shouldn't say no matter what, but the principles are true, right? It's just a matter of how you implement it that changes. And so what she did is she actually took manila folders and they put the identity, the investment or the commitment of the future self that they want to become. And we call that identity, right? It's like the identity they're trying to create in their life. And they put it on a manila folder and stuck it to the wall. And now every time they do something that relates to that new identity during the day, they get to put a little ticket into their own folder. So they're literally taking votes for their future self every day. It's like, all right, every time I do something that is part of my commitment and investment to my future self, boom, I'm going to put it in a ticket. So that could be like, okay, I have a goal to be an author, right? So it's like every time I write, I'm going to put a ticket in. Every time I write down an idea that goes into my book or my writing, I put it in a ticket, right? So it's just a physical manifestation of that progress you're making. And then at the end of the week, you can count up how many tickets you have. You're like, oh my gosh, I did so much this week towards my goal, right? And it gives you that confidence and motivation to keep going. And there's almost nothing more powerful than momentum in pushing you towards your goals and creating the compound effect in your life. So
I want to share this example. A couple more examples we'll share with you guys. This is from Ben Hardy in The Gap and the Gain, talking about a friend and his view on, where literally his beliefs and his belief system, his religion, he realized was getting in the way of his seeing things in the gain and not the gap. I'll just read it.
yeah.
Even religion, which is supposed to bring people hope and healing, can be a reason people go into the gap. As one friend told me, I've always measured myself against perfection because that's what I believe God can make me, and I'm never measuring up. Maybe he didn't get the memo that God is in the gain, not the gap. We focus on not being as far as the next guy or why he's taking so long and how we're never enough. God is focused on how far we've come and the direction we're heading. God isn't beating us up for not being perfect, but cheering us on with growth and progress we're making. I love that because I've fallen into that trap. It's like even these ideals are supposed to help us find more happiness and growth, perceived in the wrong light can be a burden and
Mm-hmm.
this albatross hanging on our neck, right? And it's like change the way you look at things and the things you look at change, right? I
Mm-hmm.
change best by feeling good, not by feeling bad. Like this is the way to measure real progress, right? The way I believe fundamentally that God measures our progress, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
not beating us and it's like, yeah, you just failed again all the time. You're not perfect, right? It's like I think he's cheering us on for all the progress and effort we give.
Absolutely. Well, and a friend mentioned to me today, and I think it fits really nicely here. She's like, we can't see the whole picture, right? We don't know the future, and to count ourselves like falling short, we don't know what opportunity comes along the way. Like one thing I've noticed about some things that take longer than I expected is a lot of times I'll come up with something better in the meantime, or I'll make a connection that helps me make even more progress faster, right? So it's like we think that there's always this gap, but we don't necessarily know why that gap exists. And it's possible that that gap exists for a reason, to give us more space to make a connection, to see an opportunity that we couldn't have otherwise had we been moving too fast. And there's all kinds of ways to look at this. Obviously, measuring backwards is the first and foremost, but then also understanding that the gap exists for a reason, and there's a reason why we aren't at that rainbow yet, right? It's like there's still some progress to be made, and that's okay. And there's a quote here that I love from Darren Hardy. He says, "Success is not perfection. Success is progress. Just be better today than you were yesterday. And if for some reason you aren't, be better tomorrow than you are today."
And it's just a compassionate, beautiful way to look at the world, to look at others, and to look at ourselves, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is living in the gap is beating yourself up for not being perfect. That's what
Well,
it
and
is.
we could do a whole other episode on not measuring other people with the gap either, right?
You
Not
know,
looking at other people with the gap.
ironically enough, that would probably be extremely useful because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? It's like maybe we should do that. Maybe we can ask you as the listeners to share examples of you've seen either in yourself of others of living in the gap mentality versus living in the gain. Because I think if we were to share 10, 15 examples of this, like that's where people would start to be able to be like, oh, I do that. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Oh, and the first step is to recognize what's happening, right? Recognize these thought patterns where it's like, oh, shoot. Yeah, I do that. Right.
Well, one of the biggest things, two examples real quick. Sorry. We're going on too long at this point, but two examples. One is with parenting,
Yeah.
obviously holding our kids up to a standard that is unrealistic, and not measuring them in the game like you were talking about earlier. The other one is holding other people to a standard we keep. It's like whether that's a religious standard, whether it's a political standard, whatever that standard is, or even an opinion is, and we assume that everyone else should be living that as well. And that I feel like is keeping others in the gap and not allowing us to build a better relationship based on the fact that people are different than us.
Mhm.
Maybe they're further along, maybe they aren't as far along, maybe they believe something entirely different. And that's okay. And living in such a way that allows everyone to do it at their pace, in their way, as long as that way, of course, is legal. You know what I'm saying? Not to get into the weeds, but and so that's my 2 cents on that. But
Yeah. We could probably dive into any situation. You know what I mean? It's like because we all, let's be honest, let's go to something that is the most important thing, our relationships with our spouses, with friends, with children, parents, right? That is where I think it's very easy to, where does that relationship fall short of where you wish it would be? Do you know what I mean? Or because people are people, we all are going to fall short either in reality or in sheer perception and expectation,
yeah,
right? And I think that's a very quick one when we start to get into the gap and it's like, oh, they didn't live up to my expectation.
yeah,
And so you focus on the gap between what reality is and the expectation, the ideal that you're holding for them.
yeah. That's a great method to judge a restaurant, not a great method to judge your spouse. There's a quote that I want to finish with that's from Greg McEwen, and I think it fits nicely with all of this.
Yeah.
If you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. If you focus on what you have, you gain what you lack. And it fits really nicely with this gap in the gain situation. When we start focusing on what we have and how far we've come, we will gain what we lack. And we will be happier in the moment and have more motivation and energy to do the things that are going to take us where we want to go.
Jeff, okay, I know we're going long here.
Yeah,
we put some titles trying to explain, okay, we wanted to come up with some titles and some stuff. So we shared with Chat GTP, which is actually really quite fun. Whoever in the world hasn't tried this by now. And we asked it to give us some ironic titles. It came up with some really good stuff, but we wanted to share some of these ironic titles that's exactly the opposite of the message we're trying to share today. But they were so funny that we just wanted to end with a few of them. If Jeff can find those.
Yes, ironic titles. We actually meant it from a positive perspective, but being a computer, it just interpreted what we didn't, it filled in the gap. And so here you go. Here's the ironic titles. How to live in the gain while still being miserable. The joy of celebrating mediocrity, living in the gain.
This is not that, right? Like for all those who are still you won't be less ambitious living this way. You'll just be more happy. Keep going. Keep going.
It says the art of settling, living in the gain instead of striving for excellence. The benefits of lowering your standards, living in the gain. The power of giving up, living in the gain instead of chasing your dreams. That was one of my favorites.
The power of giving up.
Gosh. The gain mindset, how to be content with being average. That's a really good one. From ambition to apathy, living in the gain. The art of justifying your lack of progress. The benefits of embracing mediocrity. The secret of being happy with being stuck. So if all you can sense is, hey, I'm stuck and I just want to be happy where I'm at, well, this is also a good way to do it. Measure your gain.
I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it at all, if I'm honest. Right? I don't believe that anyone will be less successful or less ambitious. They want to achieve less by living and thinking in this way. I mean, the happiness advantage is all about this concept of actually, if you think in a way that leads to happiness, you'll have better results. You'll have quicker, faster, more accurate. Like, this will help you. It's not going to take away your ambition. Right?
That's why I always call gratitude the magic bullet, because you're absolutely right. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that when you start everything you do with gratitude and a positive attitude, it will move you faster, better, and further than you ever could go with the opposite mentality. Like, living in the gain will give you all the fuel and energy you need to make the progress you want. And it is like that, like Darren Hardy said, right? Success is progress, not the other way around.
Living in the gain and living with gratitude are almost synonymous, right? Yeah. It's gratitude for the progress you've made. It's the gratitude for the change and progress of others from the situation. Like it's measuring against the progress, not the ideal.
Yeah. It's coming with a heart full of gratitude and honestly compassion, flexibility with yourself and with others to understand that no one's reached an ideal. There's no perfect person on the planet today. And there never will be again, I should say. We thank you guys very much for listening.
Yeah, just, oh gosh, we've ended this like 30 times and I can never remember. 101 times to be exact. This is the 102nd time.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We love to hear feedback, and again, reviews on Apple Podcasts is what we're aiming for. And if you found this useful today, please share it with somebody. Like, we don't do anything to grow. We're not out here marketing this. It's purely word of mouth. So we appreciate it if you share this message if it can help someone.
Absolutely. You guys, it's time to start living your best life.